So our one groups have been discussing this book, and obviously we've been in this series now for several weeks. Last week, Pastor Aaron gave a great sermon on journeying through the wall, and our guest speaker is going to follow up on that and speak about this series, about the enlarging your soul through grief and loss. But he's also going to tell his story. I'm sure you agree with me that some of the most admirable character traits a person could ever display are traits like courage and honesty. The willingness to be intellectually honest about what they believe and why. And the courage to be open about that, even in the face of repercussions, even when there's a price to pay. Especially after my journey over the past few years, I think I respect that more than anything else. That's true of many of us here in this room. You've displayed integrity and honesty in your own journey, and our guest speaker has done the same. So I'm going to give David Roberts a proper introduction, and then we're going to welcome David up here. Right now, David is the pastor of preteen and young adults at Rock Point Church in Queen Creek. He loves theology, the Utah Jazz, Lord of the Rings, and snowboarding, and in that order. David graduated from the University of Utah with degrees in communication and English, and is currently earning a Master of Arts in Global Leadership from Fuller Theological Seminary. He and his wife, Amy, have 2 daughters, and they live in Gilbert, and we're so proud to have David here at One Church today. So David, come on up. Let's give David a very warm One Church welcome. Come on up, man.
Thanks, man. Thank you. I feel honored to be here. I have a very dry sense of humor. Apologize for that. I'm not sure if that's going to pop up today. It may. This is kind of weird for me. I've been at Rock Point for 5 years now, and it's going to end next weekend. And they don't know that yet, by the way, so spoiler alert. But I kind of have home court advantage there. They kind of know who I am. I have an established identity there. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about the crisis that I'm having right now because I am losing that identity. And that's probably a good thing. I mean, it's not always healthy to form your identity around your vocation, around something that you think is going to fulfill you, when in fact, most of the things that we think are going to fulfill us in life usually let us down in the end, and that's a little bit about what this chapter in Peter Scazzero's book is about. But a little bit about myself, like Ryan said, I'm married. My wife Amy is over there, behind the guy with the cool mustache. And we have 2 daughters, Marina and Clara. Marina is 2.5, and Clara is 7 months old. And I am the epitome of privilege. I'm obviously white, male, Protestant, straight, cisgender. Parents were together and then, as part of the American dream, got divorced. I have really never experienced serious grief and loss in my life, at least not directly. There are people in my life who've experienced great deals of grief and loss. My wife, my brother, my mother to a bit less of a degree. I have lived a charmed life. And so when Ryan first asked me to preach and he showed me what I was going to be preaching on, I thought, I have zero life experiences to contribute to this topic of grief and loss and experiencing this. So I was like, well, I'm going to do what I do to most things. I'm going to approach it incredibly academically. I'm going to read about it and get some, nerdy quotes and, just floor everyone with my just deep wells of knowledge and expertise and stuff like that. And in the preparation process, I kind of came face to face with this crisis of identity that I'm going through right now and wasn't even completely aware of. Aaron last week, kind of bummed, haven't met Aaron yet, which is weird, but so I'm talking about him. But Aaron talked about this stage in healthy emotional development called the wall, and in a very real sense, I am at this wall stage right now because probably for the first time in my life, I am experiencing a great deal of grief and loss, and it's a loss of, well, first off, it's a loss of my vocation, I willingly entered into unemployment and get to experience that over the next, hopefully, couple of weeks as opposed to months, but we'll see. But not just loss of vocation, but loss of identity. Who I am has been built around not just my vocation, my ministry, my job as pastor, my role at Rock Point, but it's been built as well around a particular view of God and a view of who that God is and what he wants from me. And for lack of a better term, I believe that view has been an idol. It's been an idolatrous view of God in the sense that I have looked towards God, I have looked towards ministry, I have looked towards this identity that I am building about myself. And it's been this kind of glorified wish fulfillment, trying to find satisfaction in who I think God is and what I think he wants me to do. And in the process, I think I've missed some things, and I'm thankful to God, who I still believe in, by the way, for kind of maybe breaking me out of that. And it's kind of in that brokenness that I think for the first time I may be discovering who God really is. And so that's a little bit of what I want to share today. Part of my kind of privileged story includes my entrance into ministry itself. I moved down to Arizona. I was going to say on a whim, actually. I was chasing a girl. She's here today, and I'm married to her, so that worked out. Would have been awkward without all of those details. But I've been here for a while, and I didn't know that I was going to go into ministry, but pretty soon after being down here, the most spiritual experience of my life was feeling that call and kind of getting this idea that this is what God wants me to do with the rest of my life. And it's weird to now be in this moment because a lot of the reasons that I got into ministry are not valid for me anymore. Who I thought God was and what I thought he wanted me to do, I don't think that way anymore. And so that's a huge part of the identity crisis. But for whatever reason, God has used loss. And I really didn't realize this until I was reflecting on it this week, but God has used loss to kind of get me to this point. And so I'll talk about that in a moment. But what does this book say? Emotionally, is that what it's called? Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I've read not all of it. I've read the chapters kind of before and after the one Ryan asked me to preach on. And I think this is a great book. My wife's going to steal it from me after today, now that I'll be done preaching on it. But really appreciate how Peter Scazzero approaches this because, first off, he points out some of the ways that we as Americans, and I almost feel like our culture trains us to do this, but the way that we as Americans are conditioned to completely avoid loss. We approach it with denial, with minimization, with intellectualizing or rationalizing. I do that a lot. We approach it with hostility at times. But what we don't usually do with loss is embrace it. We don't go through it. We go around it. And that's kind of been a hard truth for me to wrestle with over the past really 6 months as I began to realize that I was going to be leaving my current vocation, leaving my current situation. Just living out this reality that our society has no place for loss. And yet, and Peter points this out in the book, loss is an inevitable part of our lives. All of us, face loss at various times. We experience loss of youthfulness. I'm 29 years old, and some of the older people in the room are going to scoff at this, but I feel like I'm experiencing loss of youthfulness. I'm not looking forward to turning 30 next year. I think I'm going to have kind of like a mini midlife crisis. I'm starting to have weird aches and pains. My shoulder hurts a lot. And sometimes my back hurts if I have bad posture, and so now I realize that I have bad posture. We lose our youthfulness. We lose stability. My wife and I are in the midst of that right now. We lose our vocation, our income, our sometimes our relationships, and there's stability lost there. We lose identity. We lose. Sometimes we have catastrophic losses. I've kind of mentioned I've been blessed in this regard. I've experienced catastrophic loss indirectly through the people in my life, but I haven't personally experienced it yet. But just just straight up statistically speaking, most of us will experience a catastrophic loss in our life. And then there's the loss of God, of faith, and not necessarily in an atheistic sense, but in the sense that who we believed God to be and what that meant for our lives shifts, it changes, sometimes it goes away entirely. And it's when I read that as I was going through the book that I realized I have an angle, I have a story to offer through this. So like I mentioned before, loss has fueled my ministry. I think God first started kind of pointing me towards ministry in college when two of my friends became atheists. And you can nod along if you've heard this story before. Growing up in a hyper conservative, literalistic view of the Bible, and the earth is not too old, and certain scientific views are frowned upon. Come to secular college, and all of a sudden, triple PhD biology professor paints a different picture. Christian goes back, talks to pastor, and I'm paraphrasing, says, "Stick your head in the sand and pretend, just, la, 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 I don't know, I don't hear that." Well, unsurprisingly, young Christian sides with triple PhD biology professor or geology professor or astrophysicist, fill in the blank. And so two of my dearest, closest friends, they walk away from the faith. And so I have this crisis. My foundation has been attacked, and I respond essentially by closing myself off. And I adopt this incredibly confident, apologetic, kind of like, I'm going to argue everyone into submission view of faith. And it's through that lens that I kind of cannonball into ministry when I graduate from college. And it's going awesome. Very providentially, God gives me this internship at a church near here, and it's great. I'm pastoring students, and all of a sudden I realize that this view of God that I have been building / kind of receiving from the way I'm viewing Scripture, it's great on paper. It sounds awesome, to kind of pontificate as I got my big, thick, systematic theology textbook that I drag into coffee shops to conveniently enter into conversation with, heathenistic people who believe in weird things like free will. And yet in the face of a student who is going through their parents' divorce or dealing with substance abuse or identity issues of their own, and or even as something as seemingly benign as a breakup, and yet remembering when I was in high school, just the world-shattering feeling that something like that felt like. And here's my intellectualized God, and he can't speak into that. In fact, this God that I have subscribed to, I can't even be fully confident that he loves everyone that I'm talking to. And so how can I comfort, how can I encourage, how can I even pray for these students when this God that I am selling, so to speak, he doesn't really have room for them? And so that foundation begins to crumble again, and so I do what I do, which is I go to the internet, and I because I'm convinced at this point that to be a rational, intellectual Christian, I have to subscribe to this school of thought. And come to find out, I was talking to some friends on Friday. Come to find out, that's not the case. And there's this whole world of Jesus-loving people out there who have figured out there's another way. That includes everyone in this room right now, which is awesome. But so I began this journey. It's been about 5 or 6 years now since that point where I've been rediscovering who God is. But it's been a discovery that has shaken my world, and I've experienced a ton of loss. And it's affected almost every facet of my life. Theologically, obviously, but socially, relationally, politically. I mean, I like gay people now, It feels really nice to be able to say that. That's cool. The dynamic that my wife and I have in our marriage where, I don't have to make all the decisions because she's a rational human being. That feels good. I don't have to think Bill Nye the Science Guy's evil anymore. I'm sure a lot of you maybe came to this place, and I don't presume to know exactly where everyone in this room is, but you have, maybe it was the science thing, maybe it was the church's attitudes towards the LGBTQ community, roles of women, fill in the blank. For me, it's been a breath of fresh air to just get to change my mind on all of those things. But what I haven't factored in until recently is the toll that takes. And over the last couple of weeks, I've really gotten to experience it for the first time. Because these shifts, these changes, these different views, they're unsettling. They're unsettling to me. They're unsettling to the people in my life, and that creates a tension. I know I have felt that tension on the other side before, and so to some degree, I have a lot of sympathy for people who are feeling those things, even if they're kind of where I used to be and where I maybe hopefully don't want them to be anymore. I'm a Rob Bell fan. It's nice to be able to say that at church. Again, he had this, there's this period where I couldn't. But Bell says this thing, and he stole it from someone who stole it from someone, but he talks about this in a podcast of his, but it's this, it sounds like a Chinese proverb, I have no idea if it is, but it goes like this. It says, the river, and the mountain is the mountain. And then one day the river is no longer the river, and the mountain is no longer the mountain. And then later, the river is the river again, and the mountain is the mountain again. The end. What does that mean? Typical Rob Bell. Euphemisms and stuff. But what it means is you have this way of viewing the world. Everything fits. Everything has a label. Everything has a category. It's all very stable, very controlled. And then one day, maybe it's a Damascus Road moment, maybe it's a journey, but you wake up one day and all of a sudden, the river is not the river anymore. The mountain is not the mountain anymore. It's different. Your labels, they don't work anymore. Your categories are obsolete. And there's this tension. And some of us respond to that through denial. Some of us respond to it through avoidance. Some of us get hostile. Some of us get defensive. But eventually, maybe we embrace it. And then once again, maybe it's a moment, maybe it's a journey, but we wake up one day and suddenly the river is the river again and the mountain is the mountain again. And not because we've gone back to the way we were before, but because we resettled in this new normal. And this isn't going to happen just one time in our lives. It's going to be going to happen again and again and again. And I think I finally accepted in the last 6 months to just enjoy the ride. Scazzero, in his book, he spends a lot of time talking about Job. And in Job, if you're familiar with the story in the Old Testament, this is someone who faced catastrophic loss, only to find God in the midst of that storm, quite literally in the case of Job. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Job. If you've been kind of going through this book with One Church in your communities and stuff like that, check it out. There's a lot of cool insight there. But a couple things I want to camp on before I get to the part of the Bible I'm going to look at. Job did 3 things that I think are super important. So maybe my story isn't your story. Maybe your loss is more in the catastrophic vein, a death, a broken relationship. Maybe it's vocational for you right now. Maybe it's a combination, but 3 things I want to point out before diving into something different. Job names his pain. There's no denial in Job. The church in America has lost a category for lament. We don't have space to lament, to mourn. Job mourns. Job doesn't blame God. Blame isn't shifted. And finally, and this is super key, I think, for people, is Job was innocent. I think there's a temptation sometimes when we're feeling loss of any kind, the kind I'm experiencing, maybe whatever you're experiencing or have experienced, to think, what did I do wrong? Part of my shift has been realizing sometimes bad stuff just happens. And it's not that God caused it, but it's that God meets us in the midst of it. And so that's kind of what I want to focus on instead. If you have a Bible, in hand, you can turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 27. If not, it'll be on the screen. This Bible appeared before me, so I'm going to use this one. But verse 47, crucifixion of Jesus. We're going to jump right into the heavy stuff. Says this. Let's start in verse 45. That might be on the screen, but I'm going to start there. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema. I don't know what that says. But it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he's calling Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, at that moment he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. Bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. And I think I just read a little farther than I told you I was going to. What's going on here? One thing that I've realized kind of theologically in my journey is that there is no God behind the back of Jesus. God and Jesus should not be pitted against each other. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. And so this story of Jesus forsaken on the cross, broken, bloodied, battered, this tells us something about God. Here's what I think. I'm going to get a little psychoanalytical here, but here's what I think it tells us. From the moment we're born, or at least from the moment that we are old enough to realize that there is something other than us, there's an I and there's a thou. There are others. We feel this separation. We feel this distance, this hole. I grew up with the Donut Repair Club, if anyone's familiar with that. Super obscure, weird, conservative Christian reference right there. So I apologize if you don't. You can Google it. But he used this analogy where you got a donut and your life is the donut, and then Jesus comes and he's the donut hole and he fills it. Silly, but true to the human experience in the sense that I believe all of us experience this sense of separation, this sense of loss, this sense of longing. And almost immediately we begin to try to fill that hole. I notice my daughters kind of do this in relation to each other. They want what the other one has. And so we create this kind of this idolatrous kind of wish fulfillment scenario where we are going after things that we think are going to fulfill us, that are going to make our identity. Call this original sin. And soon after that, we realize that there are prohibitions to these things that we want. My older daughter is kind of realizing this. You're too young to eat gum. You're too young to have peanuts. You're too young to have a bunk bed and stuff like that. Surprise, surprise, those prohibitions make her want them more, because that's human nature. We'll call those prohibitions the law. And so you have this scenario where we want these things, and because we can't have them, we want them more, and we think that if we were just to get them, it's like the dog who chases the plane. What is he going to do if he actually catches it? And some of us are so blessed that sometimes we get the thing that we want, and we realize it actually doesn't satisfy. And that, I think, is what's happening on the cross here as Jesus shatters our view of who God is. He cries out, experiencing this God-forsakenness. The veil is torn in the temple, and guess what? There's nothing there. There's no mystical God gas hiding behind the temple. It's an empty room. The Holy of Holies is uninhabited. Our view of God, or whatever idol it is we have, identity, relationships, perfect job, X amount of dollars, whatever we think is going to make us happy, it's gone, we lose it. And in the midst of that loss, that's where we really find God. In the midst of that embrace, because make no mistake, Jesus embraced his death on the cross. He went to it willingly, hanging there saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. The idol dies. And 3 days later, hopefully literally, but maybe metaphorically, it could be much longer, our view of God is reborn, something new later. And if you don't think that this is accurately describing what Jesus is talking about, earlier in the book of Matthew, he kind of does the same thing. In Matthew 10:39 and 16:25 says it pretty similarly. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. 16:25, pretty much the same thing. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will find it. Rather than approaching loss with an escapist mentality, with a minimalistic mentality, a minimizing mentality, an intellectualist mentality, Jesus is saying, guys, you got to embrace it. And that sounds counterintuitive. It doesn't sound like good news, but let's think about this very practically. Although maybe a little morbidly. You have a group of people kind of sitting around the table. Maybe a loved one has recently died. No one wants to say anything. It's complete silence. In that moment, everyone at the table is enslaved by their grief, enslaved by their suffering. But then maybe someone gets up the courage to tell a story about, we'll say the person's name is Johnny. So someone tells the story about Johnny. One person starts laughing at the memory. One person starts crying because they're just overcome with the grief. But in that moment, as they begin to name their grief, name their loss, name their suffering, they begin to process it. They begin to become freed by it. They experience joy in that moment, and then healing begins. Resurrection can begin at that moment. That's kind of the stage I'm in. I've spent a long time, maybe 2 or 3 years, kind of denying this loss of identity that I'm experiencing, denying, avoiding, rationalizing, trying to kind of put labels on this view of God that has died and then been reborn, and to be perfectly honest, I think a much more biblical way. And it's taken the last couple months to realize that satisfaction, fulfillment, God himself is not found out there. It's not found in these very controlled, boxed up, comfortable ideas that I have. But it's found in embracing these transitions, embracing the complexity of life, embracing loss at times. This radical embrace of the world. And Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am. It's in communities like this that you're a part of here today that God actually shows up. Not in some holy of holies that we've kind of constructed for ourselves in our mind, in our lives, what have you. If it's not God for you, fill in the blank. It might be a relationship, it might be a job, it might be in the past, it might be a memory, it might be not something that you're striving for, but something you're trying to get back to. Whatever the case may be, it's not going to satisfy. That satisfaction, that fulfillment, that resurrection is going to be found not in going around your loss, but in embracing it and going through it. A quote by Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the real Bonhoeffer, not the one that has in the last 5 years been kind of appropriated by conservative evangelicals, but the real Bonhoeffer, the one who was executed in the face of Nazi Germany for refusing to kind of take part in his own church's acceptance of that brutal and violent regime. And he says this with regards to loss, particularly the loss of people in our lives. He says, there is nothing that can replace the absence of someone dear to us, and one should not even attempt to do so. One must simply hold out and endure it. At first, that sounds very hard, but at the same time, it is also a great comfort. For to the extent that the emptiness truly remains unfilled, one remains connected to the other person through it. It is wrong to say that God fills the emptiness. God in no way fills it, but much more leaves it precisely unfilled, and thus helps us preserve, even in pain, the authentic relationship. Furthermore, the more beautiful and full the remembrances, the more difficult the separation. But gratitude transforms the torment of memory into silent joy. One bears what was lovely in the past, not as a thorn, but as a precious gift deep within, a hidden treasure of which one can always be certain. You're here today, many of you probably because of loss. Loss of a particular view of God, loss of a community that you once called home, loss of relationship, maybe loss of a loved one, fill in the blank. Bonhoeffer's point here, and I think it's consistent with what we see in the God revealed in Jesus is that it is through those losses that God forms us. And to be clear, this isn't a sadistic embrace of pain and suffering. It's an acceptance of its reality and a hope, a great confidence that it's in those moments, those losses, those embraces of life's complexity, that's where God is. That's where God meets us. You see, there's a difference between charity and solidarity. And I think so often we view God as kind of the ultimate charity giver. And in many ways he is. God gives grace. The Greek word for grace is where we get the word charity. God is a gift giver. But even more than that, God is the ultimate solidarity giver. God meets us in those moments. And so Scazzero, to be very practical as I kind of start to wind down here, Scazzero kind of gives us a kind of a 5-step method of going on this journey. So wherever you find yourself, whether you are in the midst of a loss, whether you're looking at it in the rear view mirror, but it still rears its ugly head every now and then, or whether you see it on the horizon. For me, it's kind of all three right now, at least in kind of the story I've told. But step one is pay attention. Don't minimize, don't deny, don't escape. Process what you're feeling. This community, for most of you, is an outlet for that. Process what you're feeling. Process it with Ryan, process it with Aaron, process it with the person sitting to your right or to your left. But process the loss. Experience it. It's going to hurt. God will be there. Number 2, wait in the confusing in-between. Your temptation will be twofold. You will try to answer the why, and you will try to fix it. What Job realized in those moments was that there is no why. There is no why sometimes. Sometimes life is just cruddy. That's reality. It's not because God caused it. Depending on your theology, it might not even be because God allowed it, but you can have complete confidence that God will be there in it with you. And don't try to fix it. Let go of that control. Embrace the gift of limits. I think, especially American Christians, we try to do more than God intended. We try to fix church, save the country, what have you. When really God's just calling us to just take a step along the way. We're not the master builders. We're just pieces of the puzzle. It's humbling, but it's freeing. You are free to be you in all of your limitations, all of your flaws, all of your brokenness. God embraces you just as you are. And so you don't need to stress out over trying to fix it, over trying to overcome these things in your life. It's not settling. Don't see this as settling, but it's getting off the throne of our lives and kind of recentering the story around God. Not in kind of a narcissistic view of God, but in a view of God that is radically with us and for us. Climb the ladder of humility. This one's a little technical. If you have the book, Scazzero kind of lays out like 7 or 8 steps. What I want to focus on here is the reality that humility is patience, it's perspective, and it's presence. I already kind of mentioned patience. Don't rush the grieving process. Let it play out. Perspective is seeing the big picture. Part of that is your limitations, but part of that is just the reality that sometimes there is more going on here than we realize, and it's only in hindsight that we see the big picture. Trust that. And presence. Don't escape it. Be there in that moment. I'm horrible about this. I'm like super future-minded. I'm a planner. My wife and I are kind of opposite in that way. We balance each other out very nicely, but I'm constantly like, oh, I'm not stressed about this because I've literally already experienced it, like imagining it in the future. It's great. Sometimes I can process trauma as it happens well, but it also makes me a uber control freak. Don't be a control freak, just be present. And finally, and this is kind of how I'm going to close, allow the old to birth the new. This is the idea of resurrection. And this is key because I think we can miss this a lot. We look at the resurrection of Jesus and we think, oh, so cool. He reversed death. Guys, Jesus didn't reverse death. He embraced death, and he came out the other side. And that's not just semantics. See, if he was going to just reverse death, and it's just a delay of the inevitable. It's a denial of what is simply true about life. There is loss, there is death, there is grief. There's pain, there's suffering. But Jesus embraced it. And in doing so, he stole its sting. And he came through the other side. We call that resurrection. Guys, allow your losses to be launch pads for resurrection. Go through them, not around them. At the end of his life, Job, after God gives him this kind of big speech where Job kind of walks away realizing that he didn't have all the answers, God says this to him. Do we have that one, the Job verse? My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Guys, we go through our lives having this idea of God in our head. We use these big, weird words, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, immutable, impassible. I'm not saying some of those things aren't necessarily true about God, but that's not where we meet God, is this philosophical idea to be strived for and to talk about in coffee shops and stuff like that. We meet God in the dark night of the soul. We meet God at the lowest point in our life. We meet God in loss. We meet God when we embrace the world, when we embrace the poor, when we embrace the marginalized, when we embrace our own frailty. We meet God where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name. That's where resurrection happens. On the cross, Jesus meets us in the storm. We find God when we embrace that frailty. One of my favorite theologians is a guy named Jürgen Moltmann. He's 90 years old, still kicking, German guy. He says it this way: God weeps with us so that we may one day laugh with him. Guys, that's a hopeful statement. And here's what I want to leave you with. I entered ministry. I entered this stage in my life that I am currently leaving with a lot of certainty, with a lot of confidence. And certainty is nice for a season, but certainty leaves no room for hope. And guys, if Christianity is about anything, it's about hope. And so my encouragement to you, whatever you're feeling, whether it's loss of identity, loss of relationship, loss of a loved one, leave room for hope. Because in leaving room for hope, you're leaving room for God himself.